Hi everyone, my name is Santiago Ripoll. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies. I'm also a researcher for SHAP. And in this video, I'm going to talk about rapid remote context analysis. I hope you find it useful. So first, to start with, I'd like to clarify what we mean by rapid remote contextual analysis and why we would wish to do it. So first, I wanted to signal that the concept remote does not mean that you are geographically distanced from the situation that you are studying, but actually that you're not fully engaged in a humanitarian response or in data collection. So when you do a remote context analysis is where you have the headspace to reach out to the available data and to reach out to experts and seek insights that might help you in a humanitarian response. So the kind of insights that you can get from a remote context analysis would be to understand the key elements of the context that will influence the response at different levels. And then by virtue of having that knowledge of the context, you'll be able to adapt standard responses into context-specific and tailored responses. And as I was mentioning before, we often forget that there's really rich data out there that we can use for the design of new interventions. And these often forgotten qualitative data that we could gather through remote context analysis. So what is remote context analysis? So it is the analysis of the complex dynamics of a given situation. What we do is we unpack the political, economic, social, cultural, and spatial factors that can then shape the success or failure of a humanitarian response. And as I was saying, we do it remotely as a way of being detached from the action. And what we do is we analyze the available academic and grey literature, and we also mobilize experts to address a particular problem. So why would we do a rapid remote context analysis? So they serve to support the design of more specific primary data collection efforts that might happen afterwards. So it's a way to sort of keep up to date to where we're at, and then to actually have very sort of narrowly defined empirical questions we can ask. They can help in shaping priorities in the design of humanitarian activities. And most importantly, they ensure that humanitarian actors are aware of the contextual factors, and they don't come in with a blueprint of activities to roll out, but instead they adapt their research, they adapt their activities to the specific realities and the world views of the people they are working with. These context analyses also allow for a historical overview of both political and social processes that will help in determining who are the key players, what are the dynamics of trust and mistrust. And I was saying before, the rapid remote context analysis enables us to bring in knowledge and experience that is often neglected in humanitarian response. So from disciplines like history, politics, culture, and this enables us to make this knowledge very operationally based, very practical. So what doesn't the rapid response context analysis do? So we need to be very careful that because we're using available data, it might not be up to date. So as communities and humanitarian situations change in time, what we need to do is to make sure that we complement our secondary data gathering and our expert mobilization with primary data analysis. And I was mentioning before, by virtue of doing this context analysis, we'll be able to know what is missing in our knowledge. So it will help guide and help target existing knowledge rather than replace it. Primary data gathering rather than replace it. And then, so as part of the remote context analysis, there's an initial engagement that has to be done with community members and with stakeholders and humanitarian actors. And a remote context analysis cannot replace the stakeholder engagement that is necessary in a humanitarian response. So once we do decide to do a remote context analysis, there are certain methodologies that we use. So we often do a desk review, as I mentioned, using secondary data that could come from academic journals, that can come from grey literature like reports, NGO reports, UN reports, or other kinds of grey literature. We do not carry out primary research, but we actually do reach out to experts that can help us determine what the field is like, what kind of literature is important, what are the issues that are most salient in that particular context for that particular problem. Sometimes we organize roundtables or panels of stakeholders and experts to, particularly when it's an emerging issue. So for example, around COVID, when it was still in China, there was a roundtable that we organized to get together the key experts and social scientists to discuss the potential impact of that in Europe. And then sometimes we, as well as doing interviews, sometimes we do some content and social media analysis. And this is particularly when we've been doing this context analysis support throughout time. We can actually also gather evidence and see how the media content and people's interactions and messages through social media, how it's varied through time. So just to emphasize that most usually context analysis is not about primary data collection. So it's important that when you're engaging with experts, it's about finding the right literature. It's about making sure that you're tackling the specific contextual issues correctly, but it is not replacing primary data collection that you will need to do at a later stage. One of the things that we do work around is working with the audience to which our analysis will then be presented. So we work with humanitarian organizations or with government bodies or with NGOs. And if we want to influence the way they think and the way they do their work, what we do is we work with them to define the research question. So in that way, we ensure that it's narrow enough and that it's answerable and that is actually relevant and is going to feed into their work. So what we do through this engagement with the user or audience is to ensure that it is operational, so that it links to existing policy processes and practices in the field, and that points to the responsibilities and roles of particular actors. So this idea of what are the kind of insights that these actors could benefit from. So it's not necessarily recommending things, but making humanitarian actors think differently about particular issues or think about contextual factors that might affect the way they work. So this will be covered in other videos, but the way you can slice that context to sort of get that depth of political, social, economic, and cultural factors is through the SHAP framework, in which what we do is we look at a whole variety of disasters and emergencies, and we try to see the interrelation between them. But at the same time, there's these contextual dimensions that we use. So first is to think about the political economy. What are the power dynamics? Where does trust lie? Who are the different actors and what are the relationships between them? Then we take an approach around social difference and vulnerability, saying that there is a diversity of social groups within a community and that they have different vulnerabilities, but at the same time they have different strengths. We're also trying to see what are the types of resilience and strengths that we can build on in our response. And then finally, we understand that the people we work with in humanitarian action have different cultural logics, including the responders themselves. And it's our job to determine how culture plays a role in a particular humanitarian intervention. And at the same time, what kind of community engagement is happening throughout the response, but at the same time, what are the histories of community engagement of the health sector or the humanitarian sector with vulnerable communities. So these are these contextual dimensions are the ways that we slice the context to try and get more nuance and detail in the specific realities of a locality. So just to emphasize again that there needs to be an understanding of how and who can influence change. So a lot of the work in context analysis is to understand who are the stakeholders, who are the decision makers, and what kind of information and what kind of format, what kind of channels they would be more amenable to think about things differently and then eventually do things differently. And then, which means that it's really important to understand the policy processes and the processes by which activities are designed and implemented to see where we fit in with that new knowledge, that new qualitative knowledge. So working with stakeholders to understand their own processes and their own activities to see where we can influence to have a more context-specific lens or insights. And so this kind of context analysis, I was saying, is a very contained part of a humanitarian response. It can happen, often it can happen at the beginning, but it can also happen at particular times. But it is complemented with other kinds of primary data collection and other conventional forms of humanitarian intervention. But it's also only one of the tools that can be used remotely. So there's other tools that we use as SHAP, which are, for example, I was mentioning the roundtables, which we bring in experts. We can bring experts and policymakers to discuss a particular issue. And you can also have a role in curating the evidence that is being produced by humanitarian actors, but they don't have the capacity to manage. So our role as SHAP could be to try and gather that information, triangulate it, and create briefs that are operational and useful for these humanitarian organizations. And a lot of the work that you can do is to support social scientists to understand what humanitarian responses entail and sort of build their capacity before they go into the field. And then finally supporting community feedback mechanisms to ensure that they're context adapted. And that's it for this video. I hope you found it useful. Thank you very much.